Morning. Is the mic on? There we go. Welcome to First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati. I am Patty Kelly. I am your worship associate for this morning, and I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone, especially our visitors, both if you're sitting in a pew and if you're watching on YouTube. We are really happy to have everyone here with us on this beautiful Sunday morning. Our church is a place you can bring your whole self, your full identity, your questioning mind, and your expansive heart. We are a community committed to social justice and to supporting the various spiritual and ethical paths of our members and friends. If you are visiting with us today, please join us for coffee after the service in the room directly across from our entrance. All are welcome. The flowers today honor all of our Rockdale School volunteers. These are formerly the South Avondale tutoring group, who are now at Rockdale School instead. Thank you to our anonymous donor, and thank you to those dedicated tutors who show up every week to help our neighborhood elementary school children learn and grow. I'm happy to report that the first floor restrooms are now accessible. And yet we ask you to please keep your distance from the bookshelf area outside the sanctuary where we have had mold damage. Now, before we begin our service, let's take a moment to wave to the people watching from home, and then we will rise and greet our neighbors or say hello in the chat. And then when you hear the singing bowl ring, please return to your seats. Oh, don't you love this friendly congregation? Alex rang this singing bowl much better than I'm ever able to. So let's remember we had a little coffee hour afterwards, too. Now, as Angela lights our chalice, I'd like to give you a little background on the person who said the famous quote that I will read in a moment. Julian of Norwich was one of the most influential Christian mystics of the Middle Ages. She wrote the earliest surviving book in the English language that was written by a woman, Revelations of Divine Love. Mother Julian lived in permanent seclusion as an anchoress, An anchoress or an anchorite was literally walled off in a cell for the remainder of their lives and devoted themselves to prayer and contemplation and serving as spiritual counselors for the community. Julian lived through the devastation of the Black Plague and other tumultuous events, such as the Peasants' Revolt, and yet her writing is very optimistic. According to Victor Purton, the founder of the Center for Optimism, Julian reminds us that optimism is not denial, it is courage. So now I invite you to close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath, and listen to this brief affirmation in our uncertain times. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. Now please rise now as you are willing and able for our first hymn, which is number 30 in the gray hymnal, Over My Head.
Oh, there we go. Good morning, y'all. I think I'm going to need to do a sermon or two this year on our hymns. You know, the words to our hymns are pretty powerful sometimes. We don't sing them with the power they contain. And I think if we understood the theology of our hymns better and the stories behind the creation of some of our hymns, we might sing them a little more what? Is worthily is a word, isn't it? Worthily. If it's not, it is now. Mightily. Deservedly. How about that? So this morning is the second in a series of what I'm calling Year 1 and Year 2 Redux of what I consider the more salient messages that I've delivered to you all relative to developmental ministry for the last couple of years. Last week, via PowerPoint, and this week will again be via PowerPoint, we mostly looked at social justice, especially as it pertains to racial justice and race relations. And we also looked a little bit at organizational dynamics, which is a lot of what developmental ministry is about. And this week, we're going to spend our time really looking more at the spiritual and psychological messages that I've delivered over the last 2 years. And so if you've been coming for the better part of 2 years and you remember half of what I say, be ready for a pretty heavy dose of Sufism this morning, because we're going to talk about the scoundrels we are and the sensational scoundrels we're yet to become, sort of as a review. And I'm not going to do a lot of footnoting to the PowerPoints today because we're going to have a congregational meeting sometime after 11:30, after coffee hour, so we'll get out on time. You'll be able to have coffee hour, then we'll gather together again for those of you who want to do that. So think of today, we're going to do a silent meditation here, and then when we roll into the sermon after the musical reflection, not a terribly verbose sermon. I might have a few comments to add here and there, but we're going to use the PowerPoint I created and just sort of roll through it slowly, let it sink into our awareness, and reabsorb some of what I've shared with you over the last couple of years, okay? So, I can't remember the name of the poet at the moment, of course, but I once read a poem, and it had a line in it that really stuck with me, and I decided I would use this anytime I taught silent meditation. One of the things that I find fascinating, enjoyable when I teach silent meditation is people's reactions when they first try silent meditation. I often hear people say, "I can't do this, it drives me crazy." And I say to them, "Well, what's driving you crazy about it?" Meditation, I hate it. And I say, "Well, but I don't think it's the meditation that's driving you crazy." And they say, "Yes, it is. I don't feel this way when I'm not trying to silently meditate with you." And so I explained to them, the only thing that's going on in that moment is you're shutting out the world and you're having a direct encounter with the reality of who and what you are. And if that's driving you crazy, you got a problem for which meditation is part of the solution. And it reminds me of this line from this poem. Silence holds with its gloved hand the wild hawk of the mind. So when you try to do silent meditation, if it's driving you a bit crazy, it's the wild hawk of your mind. But if you allow silence to be long enough, the wild hawk of the mind will settle down on silence's gloved hand. So let's just do somewhat extended moment of silence today for our meditation, and after which we'll start with me gently hitting the singing bowl, and we will end with me gently hitting the singing bowl. So just like last week, there will be a PowerPoint behind me. Although this week, I also created a PowerPoint so I can look at it and not turn my head from you and always be reading from the PowerPoint while you stare at the back of my bald head. So you can go ahead and cue that up, Patricia, when you get a minute. And again, I'm not going to do a whole lot of addition to what's on the PowerPoints. I think for the most part it reads through pretty coherently, but I will pause from time to time and make some comments. And I put up a picture of the YouTube advertisement for each of these sermons so that if one of these slides is something you want to explore deeper than what you're getting this morning, you can actually watch this video and see which service this came from or whatever topic appeals to you. So my first service with you all, which was very long, you were quite tolerant because I did 2 sermons on one Sunday, was entitled Have You? And I would say the sermon prelude to the sermon Have You was about the anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan. And in that sermon, I shared this with you. For those of you who were here, do you remember these? Do you remember what these were about? Do you remember why I put shoes around my neck that day? That's right, a haiku. So when I was in divinity school, I got paid for quote-unquote shelving books in the library, which means I got paid for reading a lot of books down in the stacks. And I ran across this book of Japanese haiku, and I read this haiku, and it just struck me to the core. These shoes are my boy's shoes. This boy is not my boy. And that was written by a survivor of Fat Man, the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. And one of the things I have spent a lot of time on in the last 10 years or so is actually evolutionary biology and learning about our instinctual nature and how that affects the way we experience life as human beings and how we show up for one another as human beings in this life. And I asked us to look at my boy's shoes through the lens of evolutionary psychology. And basically, when I talked about evolutionary psychology in that sermon, I talked about our tendency to gather around and have preferential love for those of our tribe. And the fact that those who are further removed from our tribe receive less of our preferential love. And if they're removed far enough from our tribe, their experience of living in this world doesn't really mean a whole lot to us because their experience of this world, if they're too far removed from our tribe, doesn't really affect my experience of living in this world because I've got my own tribe, thank you very much. And this explains in scientific terms why our expressions of love and compassion only radiate out so far out from the scoundrels that we are. The closer someone is to us, the more love, compassion, and understanding we tend to have because we are entwined with that person in our attempts to live in the world and survive in the world. But the further out somebody is, especially if they're a member of another tribe, not really something we take into consideration from the evolutionary biology survival instinct point of view. So when an atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, it doesn't really affect us the way it would if an atomic bomb was dropped on Nashville, Tennessee, now does it? And I think that explains it. And then I pivoted in that sermon to talk about Jesus. And I talked about the central message of Jesus being Advaita, which is a Sanskrit term which means the oneness of all that is on the spiritual plane. And if you look at Jesus' teaching from the perspective of Advaita, from the perspective that we truly are all one. Any separation we perceive between us is an illusion. That Jesus' words have a lot more meaning, such as, whatsoever you have done to the least of these, you have done to me. Or, inversely, whatsoever you have not done for the least of these, you have not done for me. And that's not just a prosaic teaching. That's a teaching grounded in Jesus' Advaitic experience of the spiritual reality that we actually live in. All life is grounded in a singular spiritual source. There is no other. All is one. So every woman and man, every woman and man, even the scoundrels you don't like, is our brother and our sister. And every mother and father is our mother and father, and every child is our child. These shoes are our boy's shoes. And this boy is not our boy. And also, the second sermon I did that Sunday was Have You. I'm going to start dipping into our Sufis, folks, so hang on. It's an intense ride when you're talking about the Sufis. Rumi said, your task is not to seek love. Your task is not to seek love, but to discover the barriers within yourself that you have built against love. How's that for fierce? Yeah. So I explained to you in that sermon, at the advice of somebody from Grosse Pointe, where I had previously done ministry, who said, you better explain the word scoundrel to them before you start calling them scoundrels, or it may not go well for you. So in that sermon, I explained that scoundrel to me is a term of endearment. I use it as a gentle reminder for us to go easy on ourselves and one another, and as a reminder of the purpose of our spiritual life. So here's the good news about being a scoundrel. Our instinctual nature and the conditioning we undergo is part of an evolutionary design that occurs before we become aware of that process. So a lot of the conditioning we undergo as we live this human life happens before we become autonomous enough and have enough free agency to recognize how in the world I became the scoundrel that Alex is. It happens unconsciously when we're disempowered in our early life. And because of that, we're not to blame for being the scoundrels that we are. Do you remember that? Nobody is to blame for being the scoundrel that they are. So here's the bad news. Once you know that you're a scoundrel, hopefully there will come a point in your life where you wake up and you say, I'm not as wild about the critter living in this skin as I would like to be. There's a glitch in my system. So once you realize you're a scoundrel, you do at that point become responsible from the kind of scoundrel you become henceforth. And as Ramona pointed out, it's a transformation from the bad scoundrels we are to the sensational scoundrels we might become. And I invoked the story of Jesus and the adulteress. Okay? So the Pharisees wanted to test Jesus. Now remember, Jesus was often called teacher. And what he was really called was rabbi. So Jesus was a rabbi. And the other rabbis didn't like this so much because he had a very different take on the scriptures. And so one day they wanted to test him and prove that he was a bad rabbi. So they found a woman who had committed adultery, and they dragged him to her. And they said, the law of Moses says we should stone this woman. What say you? And Jesus bent down and he picked up a stick and he started writing in the sand. And they don't tell us what he wrote, but I speculate it might have been a few names with the list of a few sins. And they left one by one. And when they were all gone, he turned to the woman. He said, "Woman, where are those who would accuse you?" And she said, "There are none, my Lord." And he says, "Neither do I." And most preachers, when they tell that story, end the story there. But the most important part of the story is the last sentence in the story when he says to her, "Now, go your way, but sin no more." The point of the spiritual life is the transformation of being from the scoundrel we are to the best scoundrel we can be. And I asked in that sermon, have you yet become the person you want to be before you die? I've been here 2 years, and if you're bold enough and you think you've become the person you want to be before you die, raise your hand. Are you done with your transformational process? All right. Because if you raised your hand, I'd be sending you an email to book a coffee with you sometime in the next week. And then I did a sermon called Tearing the Cloth to Shreds, and I invoked a paragraph from J.D. Salinger's Teddy. And if you don't remember Teddy was the reincarnation of an Eastern yogi into a Western body, and at the age of 10, Teddy's 10 in this short story, he's already exhibiting all these wonderful yogic powers that he carries over from his previous life. And he goes, I think, over to England, and they do all sorts of tests with him because they want to figure out how can a 10-year-old boy know all of this. And on the way back from England to America, he has a conversation with a young man on the deck of the ship. And he says to the young man, "You know that apple Adam ate in the Garden of Eden? You know what was in that apple?" he says. Logic. Logic and intellectual stuff. "So this is my point," says Teddy. "What you have to do is vomit it up if you want to see things as they really are." Let that sink in for a minute. The trouble is, most people don't want to see things as they are. "I never saw such a bunch of apple eaters," he said. The mind is the problem, folks. So I'm going to ask you again, have you yet become the person you want to be before you die? And I'm going to suggest to you that if you haven't, it's because you're identified with your mind, which is the wrong part of you from which to live. Once we make this commitment that we want to become, at some point, the person we can become at some point before we die, we realize we're up against it because we are up against the conditioned self. And I told you, if you really pay attention, you will find out that everything you do is driven by the conditioned self, especially the instinctual nature, whose only agenda is to keep you surviving. It runs deep to the core of our being, and it is very powerful. So if you want to undertake a transformational journey, that is what you're up against. To succeed, then, the means by which we enact this transformation must be more powerful than the mind. If you're identified with the mind and it's the impediment, you need something more powerful than the mind to overcome the mind. But we're so identified with the mind, especially here in the West, our STEM culture that no longer teaches the humanities in college the way it used to. And we're noticing this is a cultural problem set, if you're paying attention. And we Unitarian Universalists especially are so identified with our thinking selves We actually built this tradition on the rational critique of other people's religious beliefs. And we did so very proudfully. And to this day, we stay very identified with the mind as what the religious life is about. And I really push back on this idea because the mind is not what the religious life ought to be about. But we're addicted to it. So I'm going to tell you this story again. It's my favorite you joke. I could tell it to you every year, and I think you'd keep laughing. I'd keep laughing. So the tale of the little girl whose cat died, do you remember the story? Okay, so good. Hopefully you'll find it funny again. So one day, this little girl's cat died. She went home from school, and her mom had to explain to her, your cat died. And so the little girl got sad, and she went out and sat on the front stoop of her house, and she was crying like you would expect a little girl to do when her pet dies. And this old lady comes walking by and notices the little girl crying, and so out of compassion, she walks up to the little girl and she says, "Little girl, tell me, why on such a beautiful day could you possibly be so sad?" And the little girl sniffles and she says, "My cat died." And the woman thinks, how do I console this little girl? So she says, "I know it's really sad when your cat dies, but trust me, your cat is in heaven with Jesus as we speak." And the little girl looked at the old woman and she wrinkled up her nose and she said, "What does Jesus want with a dead cat?" Do you remember that one? That is Unitarian Universalism in a nutshell, folks. Not a lot of depth to it, frankly. The mind is not a strong enough force to manage the conditioned self. 'Tis love that tames that savage beast. As Rumi said, "This love is beyond the study of theology, that old trickery and hypocrisy. As for me, I've given up on my brain. I've torn the cloth to shreds and thrown it away." And so to do a deeper dive into Sufism, I did a sermon called Love Without Object. Jami, who is a Sufi mystic, said, "You may try 100 things, but only love will free you from yourself." You can contemplate that one for a year. If you have trouble living in your own skin, much of our activity in the world is trying to escape the self that we are through all sorts of activities, study, entertainment, what have you. But Jami says, only love will free you from yourself. So give up all the other games, folks. So never free from love, not even in an earthly guise. For it is a preparation for the supreme truth. In other words, the scoundrels in our lives, they're practice. Because until you can love them, you may not be ready for God. God puts the scoundrels in our lives, says Jami, so we can learn to love. So consider those scoundrels a gift. Al-Ghazali said, a seeker went to ask a sage for guidance on the Sufi way. The sage counseled, if you have never trodden the path of love, go away and fall in love, and then come back and see us. So I think if there's a difference between divine love and the love of human beings for each other, it's not in nature, but it's in degree. That's what I think the Sufis are telling us. We are learning to love better. Rumi says, out beyond ideas of right and wrong, there is a field. I will meet you there. In other words, beyond the mind is another way to connect. And when the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. Or in the words of Shams of Tabriz, I, you, he, she, we. In the garden of mystic lovers, these are not true distinctions. We're all one, folks. All right, 2 more slides. Rabia. Rabia was like a 8th century, I think it was, Sufi mystic. Rabia was asked, "Do you love God?" And she answered, "Yes." And then she was asked, "Do you hate the devil?" And she answered, "No. My love for God leaves me no time to hate the devil." That one's powerful. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be so filled with love there is no room in your heart for hatred? She was an 8th century mystic from Basra, and when she was a young girl, she was stolen from her family and sold into bondage. And one day, her owner, or one night, her owner found her praying fervently for God in the desert and decided he could not hold captive a soul such as this, so he freed her. And she became the Sufi mystic who really set the Sufi path of love afire. And ever since then, the Sufis have all been about love. Love is both the goal and the path to the Sufis. Hazrat Inayat Khan, he's the Sufi who brought Sufism to the West, said, "The lover who leans upon the beloved's response, her love is like the flame that needs oil to live. The lover who stands on her own feet is like the lantern of the sun that burns without oil." So I broke this down for you. The lover who leans upon the beloved's response, her love is like the flame that needs oil to live, meaning in order for you to be okay with yourself, you need other people to respond to you positively. Your sense of self is dependent on other. And if your sense of self is dependent on other, you've got a problem. Especially when you consider how many scoundrels there are in the world. Yes? But Khan says, the lover who stands on her own feet is like the lantern of the sun that burns without oil. In other words, the sun burns from its own internal resources. It shines from itself. It doesn't need to be fed to be the luminous, glorious wonder that it is. That's the tale of transformation right there. And so I sum this up by saying to people, do you get it from the outside or do you get it from the inside? And I think if you took that question to heart, you're going to find out you probably get it from the outside most of the time. And the journey is to learn to get it from the inside. If you get it from the outside, you are going to spend the remainder of your days hating the devil. There's a better way to live. Rabia. Oh, my Lord, if I worship you from fear of hell, then burn me in hell. If I worship you for hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for your own sake, do not withhold from me your eternal beauty. And finally, This one was called The Light in the Rose. Hafez. How did the rose ever open its heart and give all its beauty to this world? It felt the encouragement of light against its being. Otherwise, we all remain too frightened. And when I shared that poem with you, I asked you, do you identify with the rose or the light? And the point of that was to talk to you again. And I've really given you a break last year. I didn't do a whole lot of evolutionary biology and instinctual gratification with you. But the first year I hit you pretty heavy with it. But what I talked about in that sermon is, if you're the rose, then you still need to be given things in order to flourish and blossom. And if you're the light, you're a source that gives. And I connected this to our instinctual nature, and I said, our instinctual nature is what drives us. And one of the sad things about the world we're living in today is that we have truly become entrained by this notion that instinctual gratification is what life is all about. The satisfaction of my instinctual needs is what will make me happy. And so we buy into the gluttonous accumulation of goods and experiences to keep us up. But I said that that is actually one of the greatest impediments to the transformational journey. The instinctual life is there out of necessity to secure our survival. I believe that once we are secure, we need to stop indulging in instinctual pursuits, which is a way of saying, once our instincts are satisfied, they no longer need to be ruling our roost. And we then have the opportunity to live otherwise, but we don't, because we've bought hook, line, and sinker that personal gratification is what life's all about, to a great extent. Not totally, but to a great extent. And we need to learn to recognize instinctual satisfaction as the name of that game and move on and live from something other than instinct. But we don't. We continue to live from instinct. And I call that instinctual gratification. The greatest impediment to the spiritual journey. And so we need to learn, once our instinctual needs are satisfied, to stop the instinctual agenda, shift our awareness to the heart that is the center of our being and the vehicle for the spiritual journey, and learn to live from that place. And when you do that successfully, you realize you have enough. You're now one who can give. You are the light that encourages the rose to bloom. Become that. So we take the next step in love, and we perform the next action in love, and we speak the next word in love, and we think the next thought in love, and we breathe the next breath in love. That's the journey. So as Hafez says, why not become the one who lives with a full moon in each eye? That is always saying with that sweet moon language what every other person is dying to hear. Why not become that? All right. Well, all I ask of you is forever to remember me as loving you. Ishkala mabud lila. You know it. Let's stand together and we'll sing this as our last hymn. Let's sing it, I don't know, until I've passed out all the roses that I have at least, Jera. So, do you remember? Ishkala mabud lila. Right? So this side first, this side second, then the Arabic and the Arabic. All I ask of you is forever to remember me as loving you. All I ask of you is
Before we extinguish our chalice, I have one announcement that Alex alluded to a few minutes ago. As all of our members know, if they checked their email yesterday, Alex, Dr. Riegel, has announced that this will be his last year with us in developmental ministry. I emailed you information about what our next steps are, but we are also having a question and answer session today from 11:30 to 12:30 here in the sanctuary. We will also hold listening sessions on October 8th at 6 p.m. and October 14th at 7 p.m. Today, we're having an informal meeting, but we want to answer your questions. We do not have childcare, but please feel free to bring your kids in here to play in the VIP lounge during the meeting. Just please make sure to feed them something beforehand so they'll be happier. And we will start at 11:30. We will end at 12:30. We have a hard stop date because we have an event that needs to be set up this afternoon. And Alex is going to skip the receiving line because he's going to talk at the beginning of our meeting, and we want to make sure you get your coffee and snacks before you come back here. And visitors, please do feel free to come to coffee hour. We would really like to get to know you better. Now, as we extinguish the flame, I'll share with you some wisdom from Krista Taves. It is our work, shared with each other in covenant, that creates and sustains this beloved community. We extinguish this chalice, but its light lives on in the directions we have chosen today. The light of this faith lives on in us together, in our hearts, minds, bodies, and spirits. Amen and blessed be.